This video is sponsored by the following people. Please click the links in the description below.
Today we're gonna talk about geometry of knives. This is one of the most important things when you want to make high performance knives. Maybe even more important than steel and heat treatment. Just maybe. Depends on which borders you're looking at. But it is, no kidding, one of the three most important things if you want to make knives that perform well and that the user is actually gonna have fun using. My name is Tobias Hangler. I am an Austrian bladesmith and trained metallurgist. I've been making and using culinary knives for well over a decade. About 14 years ago I started, and I've been a full-time knife maker, bladesmith for about 2.5 to 3 years now. In general, the knife geometry will not only depend on the knife that you want to make, it will also depend a little bit on the user who will be using. When we talk about the geometry, we don't only speak about this view of the knife, which has its place and which is important, but most importantly we're talking about cross-sectional thickness of the knife. How thick is the spine of the knife? How thick is it before you start sharpening it, and what geometry do you use for the knife? So in general, I try to make a simplified but realistic cross-section of each of the different grinds if we keep the spine thickness and the blade height the same. So this might make sense on some grinds, it might not make sense on other grinds, but to keep these two parameters the same and to show, okay, what is this type of grind individually, I made them all the same. First up, we have the Scandi grind. A Scandi grind is basically not used for culinary. This is not a grind that you would make in exactly this blade height. It's typically shorter knives, so the grind would look something like this section, and it's typically used for bushcraft knives, outdoor knives, and for some woodworking tools. So the characteristic is that I have full thickness all the way, and then I have just one bevel that leads right into the cutting edge. So when you sharpen, you have to sharpen the entire face here. You have to sharpen the entire bevel. So while it is very good for woodworking, it can be a little bit trickier for resharpening. This grind would be much too steep. You would have way too much resistance if you cut any foods. If you have, for example, a 3.5 millimeter spine and you want to do a Scandi grind on the knife, on a kitchen knife, you will just not be able to cut a carrot or an apple or anything. It's just gonna split like with an axe. Next up, the full flat grind. What does that mean? Basically, full flat means that you have one bevel that goes all the way from the edge to the spine of the knife. This is one bevel that could, for example, be 3, 4, 5, 6 degrees in total, and you have the full thickness of the spine only at the very top of the blade. Why is this different than a Scandi grind? Obviously it's going to have a completely different cross section. It's going to be very thin, so it's actually good if you want to cut through dense foods, dense materials like a squash or a carrot. And then one important performance factor of this is as well the thickness behind the edge. This is just an example. Here we have 0.22 millimeters behind the edge. That means that right there on a smaller level, there is the sharpened bevel, which we're actually going to resharpen. And that is very, very small. Like you could, for example, see on these knives, the actual secondary bevel that is sharpened, the shiny part here, is very small because we are very thin behind the edge. You can use a full flat grind on culinary knives. Basically, the cutting performance will be very good. You will have a lot of lifetime before you have to thin out the bevels again because it's a very flat grind, especially on higher blades. You will have very little resistance again with solid food. The disadvantage is though, through the flat bevels, you will have a lot of food sticking to the side of your knife, like a slice of squash or potato or onions. Everything will just stick because it's slightly wet and it creates kind of a vacuum underneath it. It's just gonna stick to the blade, and that can be very annoying in use. Next up, the flat grind. So how is the flat grind different from the full flat? Basically, your primary bevel only goes to a part of the blade. So we have full thickness of the spine for a certain part of the knife, and then we start beveling down. For example, if we look at this knife, you could see that this is the forged finish all the way here, and then the primary bevel is only in the lower part. So this is, for example, a flat grind. That means you have a transition here where the food will easier, more likely fall off. So it will not go all the way up. It will actually be more likely to fall off in this region. It's still gonna have a shallower angle. As you can see, If you only grind part of the blade, if you only do a partial flat grind with the parameters, all the other parameters being the same, you will have a much steeper angle here, which makes the blade more robust, but it also will give you a little bit more resistance if you cut very dense foods. It really doesn't matter if you have meats or fish, anything that is a little bit softer. This angle and the thickness behind the edge will not be as important. But if you cut dense foods, the more cross section you have in the lower region, the more resistance you will feel during the cut. Next up is the convex grind. A convex grind means that we have, this is not a linear bevel, but we actually go in a slight outwards curve. So it's beveling on a convex surface to the edge. And then you will have a secondary bevel right behind the edge again. It's kind of similar in how much mass is where if you compare it to the same flat grind. So it's actually just a kind of rounded form of a flat grind, you could say. But what you get can be very well performing knives because you have the effect, like if it's a severe convexity, that the foods will fall off easier. You will have a very robust blade basically, and you can have still very thin edges, so you can grind it very thin in this part. So it's very easy to resharpen. It will just take a couple of strokes because you take very little material off the front of the secondary bevel. Another shape of a convex grind that I don't have on this picture, but we will show you digitally, is the Walkschliff. The Walkschliff is a traditional German grind, which basically is a convex grind that will also continue to be convex in the upper side. So it actually starts becoming thinner at the top too. So you lose some of your spine thickness and the food will be even more likely to fall off. This can be especially important in knives in the tip area where you want the food to glide through easily, to have low friction and also to fall off easy, because you don't want to have a very thick convex blade in the front, so you can do a Walkschliff in the front section. The hollow grind is more typical for outdoor knives, for folders, because it basically enables you to have a very thick spine and then quickly come down to a thinner edge. So like on a folder, you might want to use 3-4 millimeter spine thickness. Then you want to come down to something that is relatively thin so you can get decent cutting performance. What is it good for? So on a hollow grind, you can have very thin cross section in the lower area, which will mean that you have very low forces for mechanically splitting the material. Because if you have a thicker geometry and you have a dense food, you have more resistance for splitting, basically. The thinner your knife, the more action will actually happen at the tip. This doesn't matter too much with softer foods, but with denser foods, this can make a difference. So the hollow grind is very thin, it's very acute edge, and it has a big advantage that you can actually resharpen the knife for a very, very long time. And the thickness behind the edge will barely change, which can be very good for maintenance. Also for many other types that I'm not too familiar with, but I'm sure you've seen plenty of hollow grinds on outdoor knives and folders where you have the thick spine and then you just want to come down really quick. It also looks pretty cool, so. Next up, the S-grind. This is a very aggressive form of an S-grind, so we have a very strong profile. This is, I think, very good for demonstration. It also is a well-performing geometry. It's not, the dimensions aren't exactly what I would use usually, but it shows the cross-section very well. So we have a flat on the top of the blade, which basically provides some weight and some rigidity that the knife doesn't flex. And then you have a double hollow grind in the middle of the blade, like here. Here is the hollow grind, which will take away a lot of the mass, which will make your knife lighter and which will also make the knife thin pretty much in the entire lower area. In the front section, you basically have what is a flat grind, what can be a hollow grind. So basically you can grind the geometry like flat grind or convex grind, and then afterwards grind away these hollows so that the blade becomes lighter and that you get a better food release. Because you can imagine if you cut through a cucumber, a carrot, whatever, you make a slice, it's just gonna fall off here in the lower area already, because it can't make the curve and stick to the blade because the blade is making changes in the geometry. Any slice that will be thicker than 1 or 2 or 3 millimeters, it's just gonna fall off. Sometimes you have like the super thin slices that will still manage to adhere to the blade, but that is less likely. Let's say like the majority will fall off to the side. It's not 100%, but it is the majority. There is different versions of this. Obviously, you would get even better food release if you have a straight corner right there. This is a little bit trickier to make. It's called a hook grind. Benjamin Kamen does some of these, and I'm sure other people too. My personal take is I rather make the S-grind because it's easier to finish in a nice way. Like I can make a nice Damascus pattern with that as well. I could use the contact wheel to finish out pretty much to 600 grit and higher, and then I just have to do some light hand sanding. And also, I don't like any sharp corners in my knives in general, and I also don't like any deep structures because that will basically be where it's hard to clean, where it's hard to dry off, and I don't want to go into the corners every time I wash them. But performance-wise, probably even a step up. Last grind type that we're gonna talk about is the C grind. It can also be an asymmetric S grind basically. So we have two sides on this knife. We have basically a flat grind or a slight convex grind on the one side. That is basically the inside, or it's the side of your non-dominant hand. So this is a right-handed knife. And then we have the hollow grind here. And in this instance, we have actually a compound grind. So we have the initial grind on this surface, so the finger can rest against more material and we're not resting against something very thin here. So it's actually more comfortable to use because the heel is gonna be a little bit beefier. This again takes away some material, takes away some weight, but you will still have enough weight in the blade on the spine. So that's what I also like. If you do chopping, you don't want your knives to be too light. You want some mass that you don't get stopped purely by friction. And the thought behind this is that every surface has its purpose. So we have the weight in the back, we have the general grind that goes towards the small secondary grind on both sides. I leave the surface flat for the surface where my fingers rest again. So when I guide the blade and I cut vegetables, I have a smooth surface on this side, and then I have a hollow grind in the region where my food is typically gonna be. So everything is functional. Weight, food release, keep the heel a little bit thicker, and then just the primary bevel. You can rest your finger here, and this is a little bit more comfortable in my opinion than a grind like this, where I have the hollow all the way down. On this blade it doesn't matter too much because the hollow is further down, so here my finger doesn't rest in the region where it's very thin. Whereas on a not as high blade, the lowest part of the S grind would be right where my finger is. And also on this side, I would have a little bit harder time to guide the blade nicely. Again, this blade is so wide that I still have some good surface. This knife, I would be right in the structured area if I was using it left-handed. So it's not perfect. Right-handed, perfect for me. Every surface has its function. Everything needs to be the way it is. Whenever you're starting out, you want to learn a new grind, you want to perfection it, you want to make it your own. It's always three parameters that I look at the most. One is the spine thickness. If you want to get better, spine thickness is something that you always have to take care of. Not only the thickness in one place, but also how it changes towards the front, so the taper. Second parameter is thickness behind the edge. So how thick is your knife right behind the sharpened edge? And the third parameter that you should look at very consciously is what are the angles of your bevel. And that is going to change with the height of the grind, with the spine thickness, and with the front. So it's basically defined geometrically. Even if you do convex grinds, or if I do convex grinds, I first start out with a flat grind. I measure the angle, or I keep the angle consistent, and then I will start rounding it in. But I will still know the approximate angle that I started with to make sure that I get consistent results, that I can make changes in a systematic manner so that I get better. Try to be very intentional with your changes. Make a knife, use it, take notes how it turned out, take notes how you like it in comparison to other knives. Does it perform well on carrots? Does it perform well on softer foods? What are the advantages? With these three parameters, you can just systematically change until you are happy with the result, and then be sure to also check your results in the future that you stick to this geometry. If you got a working set of parameters, the good thing is that you don't really need to test cut every knife. Because if you keep all the parameters the same, the knife will perform very similar or the same as your test knife. So you don't have to be worried. That's one type of quality assurance that I would definitely recommend. You don't need anything but just calipers. Check your dimensions, check your angles. It's super important.
Other than you and me, you know who else loves sharpening? Tormek. Did you know that Tormek holds close to 20 patents to date? What does that mean? It means innovation is in the center of what they do. Tormek is a leading brand that offers a complete sharpening system for everything you want sharp. This means easy to use jigs, attachments to help you fit all sizes, forms and shapes of tools you want to sharpen, including kitchen knives. Development, engineering work and production are all made in Sweden. This means that you get the highest quality in sharpening innovation and the best modern manufacturing technology. Check out tormek.com. Thank you very much to our sponsors for making this video happen. I hope you found that video informative and entertaining. What knife geometry will you be practicing next? Your thoughts and feedback are always appreciated. If you want to watch Tobias make a Go My knife with an asymmetrical S-grind, check out this video over here. See you in the next video.
Yeah, I love the geometry.
Easy to make as well, isn't it?